Nawal, I'm so excited to interview you. This is going to be great. I love your posts. You have such wonderful information, and we're going to dive into some hot topics today. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, before we start, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about you, something that's not in your bio, what motivates you to do what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am an immigrant. I immigrated from Pakistan when I was 12 years old with my family. Oh. So I experienced that acculturation process where, I had a hard time understanding where I belonged or how to identify myself. So I think that's a huge part of who I am. I'm also a PhD student, so I'm doing my doctorate in clinical neuropsychology, and I'm a writer and a mental health advocate. So I really enjoy learning about health and wellness. So that's physical and emotional. And I try to share what I learn as much as I can. I think I really see that value, even though I have so much of a workload, I still do this as a passion. And what motivates me to do this is because in my South Asian community, it's the resources for mental health are just not there. They really lack. And when someone is going through mental health issues, it's really hard for them to access proper support or even understand how they can work on it themselves. So the power of social media now is that we can actually, transfer all this knowledge that we're learning as professionals to those people who can access it. And I think that's what really keeps me motivated to run that Instagram page and just allow everyone to take what they need and understand what will help them and what won't.
Oh, I love that. That's really great. And I'm so excited that you're doing your PhD in clinical neuropsychology. That's one of the fields that I did a lot of, I've also studied in. And so that's wonderful. And yes, your page is fantastic. You're very generous with your information. And it's wonderful how social media has become a platform that people can be helped. It's wonderful how much, it's really great. Because as you say, the tools for mental health in our current narrative are kind of scary and the approaches. So it's great that there's this alternative option that we have on social media. So thank you for all the great posts that you do. And based on that, your posts really are great. So we're going to talk about you have so many things that I'd love to talk about, but I've selected a few, and then obviously just jump in and add if I leave something out. So the first thing I want to talk about is psychological invalidation. You put up a great post the other day that said, and by the way, for everyone, it'll be in the show notes, but it's the Brain Coach, and that's the Instagram page. If anyone wants to go and see the post I'm looking at now, go to the Brain Coach. Great post that Nawal puts up there. I'm going to read the post. Psychological invalidation looks like, it could be worse. I'm sure it wasn't that bad. You shouldn't feel that way. Just get over it. Just let go. I know exactly what you're going through. And then you have underneath it the counter, how it's counterproductive in terms of helping. So should we just take each one and just talk it through? So it could be worse. I'm sure that wasn't that bad. What does that do? What does that kind of statement do to people?
Yeah, so psychological invalidation basically is a way where we tend to minimize the experiences of another person. So that's the gist of it, right? So when we say something like, it could be worse for another person, here we're bringing our own subjective biases and judgments of how another person should be internalizing their experience, there are times where we might have gone through something worse and we think that way, but another person coming up to you and opening up about their experience, we need to give them that space to talk about their feelings instead of minimizing them and saying like, hey, it could be worse. Don't feel that worried about it. Like, it's fine. You need to open that space up.
I love that. You need to open up that space. Otherwise, we invalidate their feeling because we're trying to become an expert on what that person feels. So it may be for you that, as you just so rightly said, you could have gone through an experience that may seem similar, but it's not the same because everyone's experience is different. And so it's very important that we don't just invalidate. And it's amazing how easily those slip off our tongue. Those statements. I think sometimes the intention is to try and help someone, but the impact is not always that, positive. It's, as you say, it's very invalidated. You actually made a really good statement there. You said these statements minimize and marginalize someone's pain and force a toxic positivity on them. Then one of the others, you shouldn't feel this way, conveys a superiority over someone. That's so interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the psychological invalidation, there's some times where we actually genuinely are trying to help a person. And then there's another way of psychological invalidation where it's a manipulation tactic. So it can almost lead to that gaslighting experience where there's a purpose of establishing that control. So you shouldn't feel that way, or you're overreacting, or, you're being so sensitive. Just all these things are really us trying to put the blame on that person, especially if we are the person who upset them. So it usually comes up when we are on the defense and we're saying these things to let the person know, like, it wasn't a big deal, or I was just joking. These things are such minimizing statements because you're not having that uncomfortable conversation of how you made the other person feel and how we can overcome that situation. So that's how it minimizes that experience and in general, that conversation.
So you mentioned gaslighting. So let's talk a little bit more about gaslighting, because it kind of relates to these things as well. So it's a very common form of psychological invalidation. And you mentioned it now. Can you talk a little bit more about it, maybe define it and give a few more examples?
Yeah. So gaslighting is a power move, right? So the purpose is to make the other person think that they are being crazy or paranoid or just overly sensitive. And it can lead to that person who's experiencing the gaslighting to really doubt themselves and think, maybe I'm being crazy, or maybe I wasn't supposed to feel the way I felt. These thoughts come up because you are being invalidated and your internal experience is not being acknowledged or validated, right? So this actually is a tactic where it just takes the blame off the person who's invalidating them. And it can lead to a lot of resentment. So some examples of gaslighting are like, what I mentioned, like, I was just joking, you're acting crazy.
Just get over it.
Yeah, or you sound stupid, that, right? Like, these things that come up in conversations, especially when we're on the defense and we're really trying to protect our own ego. But I think just allowing ourselves to understand what we're doing, or when we're receiving this kind of gaslighting comments, when we're on the other end.
The receiving end, yeah.
Yeah, when we're recognizing this, it's like, okay, we can allow ourselves to not get into the trap of believing that, okay, maybe I am crazy. We'll just be like, I understand that's gaslighting. My experience is being minimized and I need to stand up for myself here.
And it's quite common, isn't it? Especially in today's climate. I mean, there's a lot of this happening. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing that across just social media and in your experience as well, clinically as well?
I definitely am. I see it a lot in relationships and also in social media, because we all have a voice now on our platform. Let it be personal accounts or public accounts. We are able to say what we want to say, and our opinions, everyone's opinion is subjective, and it comes from the knowledge that we have taken in and put in our brains and so on. So gaslighting can really happen when there are disagreements with certain opinions or certain beliefs that people have. And I have seen it a lot, especially recently with these huge movements happening. There has been a lot of gaslighting going on. And even with, it's a combination sometimes where relationships, people arguing with their parents about certain beliefs that they hold, and the parents are gaslighting the children and the spouse. Like, it's happening all over the place. And it's really good to recognize that it's happening.
I think what you said there is very, very important. It's very good to recognize it because it's happening. It's not just a certain group of people. It's kind of everyone. As you say, it's happening with parents to their children, children to parents, siblings, friends, people that like each other and don't like each other. It's happening across the board. So it's become a kind of almost a way of speaking to people. It's become too accepted. So I think bringing shining a light on it and saying, hey, listen, if you're manipulating someone else, if you are invalidating their experience, if you're making them feel bad about saying it's stupid or whatever, to stop and just check your own, because it's hurtful. I mean, as you said so clearly, just think of when you were on the receiving end, what that felt like.
Yeah, I mean, there's been times, especially, I think I'm so passionate about the topic of gaslighting because it has happened to me. It has happened to me in my relationship. And sometimes the other person is doing it unconsciously. It is not always conscious. So it's really important to have that conversation like, hey, what you said here really minimized what I was trying to tell you. And it made me feel really hurt and really unheard. That conversation, if we are really conscious about how we're feeling, then we can communicate it to the other person. Like, that's how we feel. And then we can have that conversation and stop that behavior from happening in the future.
That's so good, because then the person that it could be, as you say, in a caring relationship, and person's doing it without even realizing they're doing it. So to say those things, that you made me feel invalidated, you made me feel hurt, to actually express that, talk it through, makes them aware, then they're more careful. So and it works both ways. And if you do say that to someone and they continue to gaslight you, well, you have every right then to remove yourself from that. You need to protect yourself.
Exactly. And protecting yourself just means, you can set boundaries around these behaviors. Yeah. So when they do this, you just have something like, okay, if you say something like this to me next time, I'm just going to pause, end this conversation, and we'll come back to it, because I'm not going to engage in the conversation where you're minimizing my experience. Mm-hmm. Or there's times when it comes to a point of abuse, and you have to really make a decision. Do you really want this person in your life, or do you want to engage with this person a lot? If you can avoid this person, will you really try to do that?
Yeah, and we do sometimes have those options, sometimes you don't. But I'm very glad that you said that, because you have this amongst groups of people. I've also experienced gaslighting. If you don't agree with a certain, it's so tribal. Society is so tribal at the moment, and it can be so much, well, you're not my tribe, or you don't believe like I believe, and that can happen. Like a whole group of people can, and it can be very hard for people. But you'll always find at the end of the day, it's so important to be true to yourself and to stand up for what you believe in. And it's hard sometimes, especially if it does mean that you're kicked out of a tribe. But at the end of the day, you're true to yourself. It's that authenticity that counts more than anything, I would think. I don't know how you feel about that.
Absolutely. I think a great shield against gaslighting is our own self-worth. It's just
very good
to have that within us, because having low self-worth is part of the problem, because we will tend to doubt ourselves when we really don't believe in ourselves. So if someone is putting something in our mind, we will really question it. But if we know who we are and what we stand for, we will challenge that person's opinion right away. So having that self-worth is really, really important to protect ourselves against these gaslighting behaviors or any abusive ways of communication.
Oh, that's brilliant and so important what you just said. My most recent clinical trials, it just reminded me of one of the subjects in the study. Actually, there wasn't one, there were a couple that were talking about that they'd had these experiences, and in amongst a bunch of abusive experiences. And it's interesting because we saw at the front of the brain, where specifically sort of just above the eyebrows, when you have a low self-worth, the energy there drops tremendously. So the functionality, the blood flow, everything actually drops, because and it's amazing until people actually, when that shifts, you see an increase in energy there. And it was interesting watching how, as this person realized that their value, their self-value changed, we saw the energy change inside the brain. And in as short as 3 weeks, we saw massive changes. So, this is real. So you're going to see the impact. Your brain, your mind uses your brain. Your brain's a responder. And your mind's literally using your brain. So if you now feeling terrible, your brain actually will then shift downward in its function. So there's a very real physical impact of gaslighting. And then that also sends a message to the whole body, and that can cause inflammation in the body. You can actually, because this particular group of subjects had a lot of inflammation, low-grade inflammation. So it's very real. So I'm just saying that to say that gaslighting is not just a word. This is not just a concept for the listeners and the viewers. This is very, very real. And if you're doing it, it's toxic to your brain and your body. And if you're experiencing it, it's toxic. So it's so important that we challenge this issue and deal with this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And it's really nice to see that there is a study out there that really allows us to understand how, that stress response comes up. Because that, I'm assuming, is happening because our body is constantly stressed out, or, whatever that is, it's leading to physical symptoms in our body, which is
absolutely
insane. Yeah.
And it's so crazy, because as we are, like, let's say someone, as you've just described, gaslights you, or they say any of these things, like, it could be worse, and I'm sure it wasn't that bad, and you shouldn't feel that way, and just get over it, and just let go, and I know exactly what you're going through. All of that invalidation immediately, like, as you say them, I even get this, like, gut feel. I don't know if you feel that you sort of get this, I don't want someone to say that to me if I've just told them some major issue that I'm experiencing or something like that. And it actually, as every moment of every day, we're directing our neuroplasticity, we're changing our brain. Our brain's always changing. So if we don't direct or control that, we change in the wrong direction. So immediately our genes change, and immediately we have those structural changes. And that's where you get the impact on the body physically in every cell, and the inflammation and all that kind of stuff, which is quite scary. So I just remembered, I want to ask you one more thing you mentioned about parents and gaslighting. Let's talk about that. Parents aren't intentionally trying to hurt their kids, but they do it. They want to take the pain away. They want to fix it. I'm a mother of 4. I know. They'll come to you with things and you just want to, no, it's going to be fine. You want to say positive statements to overcome the negative statements. And I remember this so often when I was practicing clinically, helping parents to allow their children to vent. So can you talk a little bit about parenting and gaslighting so that parents don't have to feel guilty, but that they can just have the awareness and the insight you're not helping your child, and what are the signs, how can they manage, what can they do?
Yeah, definitely. I think this hits home because in my community, with my parents even, they aren't very knowledgeable about how to communicate feelings. We don't talk about feelings in our household. So this is something that I experienced as a child growing up too, where if, I come up with a problem, if I would communicate it with my parents, which was rare, it would just come up to, it'll be fine. You're just overstressing. You just stress easily. It's totally,
you're oversensitive or something. Yeah,
exactly. Just making assumptions rather than having that space to talk about the issue at hand. And sometimes when we do this as parents, we might be unconsciously saying all these statements, but if we understand what gaslighting is and what it really does to the person, which we just talked about, then we can be really cautious of saying these statements. And rather than trying to hold on to that need to really protect our child and just make sure that they are feeling better, giving them that space to just talk and figure out the situation that they're feeling inside really gives them the opportunity to learn about what they're experiencing and become resilient afterwards. So, they understand that I was able to get through it, even though I processed all these emotions and I was still able to move past it rather than just suppress them. Because,
It's once again coming back to what we need to do is listen non-judgmentally. It's giving them that safe space where they feel that they can speak without being judged or cut off halfway through a sentence and told, something thrown at them, some kind of positive, one of these kind of statements, or even maybe in a religious environment, maybe some sort of religious statement or something like that, which is not, it's kind of make you feel guilty because you think, oh, I can't do that. I'm in this space. I don't know how to do that. And you go into your parents for the help of how do I navigate through this thing. And if you get told a blanket statement or one of those invalidating statements, those gaslighting statements, you've removed a child's ability to get it out. They're going to push it down, and that's going to cause a lot of damage in the brain and body.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing to really think about is just use open-ended questions when a child comes with problems. It's like, so what do you think, or what do you really want to do in this situation, or how are you feeling? Just give them that room to talk with, and open-ended questions really promote that. Rather than it'll be okay. See, there's no room for a response there, or you're just stressing. There's no room for a response again. So really allow them to have the ability to talk about what they're feeling. And if they really are coming to you for advice, ask them, do you want my advice, or do you want to figure out what options you have here? And we can talk about that. And then you have the end decision to choose what you really want to do,
That's
healthier conversation.
That's so good. So to ask open-ended questions, that's very key. And in asking the open-ended questions, you allow for them to be able to express themselves. And they're not just giving advice, but asking, do you want some advice? Do you want help? So letting them come from their angle so that we don't, because if we give advice, we're giving it from our angle. But if you ask someone, do you want, they're going to guide you as to what sort of advice they need. They're going to push you in that direction. You don't just assume. So it takes away the assumptions, the open-ended questions. That's really good advice. Let's talk about the emotional dumping. I love this post. I love all your posts. I think they're fantastic. Okay, so this is great. You talk about emotional dumping versus healthy venting. And like you say, things like emotional dumping would be something like blaming others. That is because you did X, I did Y. Whereas healthy venting doesn't blame others. So should we take it one by one and we can talk through each one because they're powerful. So the whole blaming thing.
Yeah, so imagine having a conversation with someone who has hurt you. It takes two people to really turn something into an argument. That's something that just happens because someone may be mistreating us or someone may be saying something that triggered us and we react. So if we are bringing the conversation back and talking about it, saying, hey, so you started this, that's why I ended up mistreating you, really just puts all the blame on the first person rather than that. Opening up the conversation like, hey, I want to take accountability for reacting the way I did. I should have paused, or I should have done something different, not mistreated you back, but I was really hurt by what happened there. Just talking about it in a way to take that accountability first rather than just put the entire blame on the person. And then this conversation will have room and the other person won't get defensive right away. That's why it's important to not blame the person right away in a conversation.
It's that blaming. It's that kind of pointing the finger, you did. The minute you do that to someone, it's immediately making them on the defensive. Immediately people feel they have to self-protect. And then they can't really hear what's being said. And then just all the emotions then block, all the negative emotions then block the ability to communicate. So just by saying saying exactly how you did that. It's fantastic. So not blaming others, but actually looking at oneself, explaining how you feel once again. All the way through, the message that is coming through very strongly is its authenticity, to be authentic to yourself, to be honest, to be open, to tell people how you are feeling, to be vulnerable instead of that reaction of argue, defend, justify. It's all about, okay, did I misunderstand you? This has hurt me. The honesty, the vulnerability.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's the main point of all of this. So we'll go through the examples, but basically what I tend to tell my clients too is when you are trying to approach a situation, use I statements. So if you are even mad at someone, if you're resentful and you're trying to communicate, instead of saying you did this or you made me feel or just anything, try to just switch that conversation and turn it into an I statement. So
very good.
I felt hurt because of what happened. That is very different than you made me feel.
That's huge. That's huge. Just saying, I feel hurt because you said versus you made me feel. Such a difference. The one is just going to lead to an explosion and negativity. The other one's going to open the door and create the space for an authentic discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, let's take the next one. Emotional dumping overwhelms the other person with multiple issues versus healthy venting sticks to one topic, does not bring up past issues. I really like that one.
Yeah, definitely. So that one is something that happens a lot because when we are emotionally charged, there's a lot of emotions in our brain just circulating, it's just our mind starts to race.
Yes.
We think about so many different things that have happened in the past, and we want to do everything to try to make the other person feel that they were in the wrong. But it just does not solve the problem when we are bringing up past issues that have already been resolved. Yes, if there's a pattern that keeps coming up, it might be helpful to talk about, certain things. But even then, sticking to one topic really allows us to work through that one thing. If we bring up multiple things, we really lose track of what the whole purpose of this conversation is. So it's just really important to stick to one topic and not bring the past conversations in it and overwhelm yourself and the other person.
Because then you don't know what you argue about in the end, and you don't know what you're dealing with, and you can't solve it because there's just too many things. So if there are multiple things, deal with the most relevant one, and if other things do come up, set another time perhaps for that, because you also don't want to overwhelm in that situation. It's not to have too long. I think this is a mistake that we all make. It's something that I used to tell my clients when I practice as well, is that don't spend hours on toxic stuff. It's detoxing yourself, but also in a discussion, don't leave it alone. You need to push. You mustn't go to bed angry and that kind of stuff. I think that's really important. And my husband and I, for example, we will never go to bed until we've solved an issue. But we try to stick. The mistakes we've made is to do multiple things at once. Rather fix one, get that solved, and then set a time, perhaps, even if it's in an hour, when you kind of calm down a little bit, and then you can deal with the next issue. Otherwise, as you say, it's just like so much. It's so overwhelming. And then everything's intertwined.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think so when things, especially, when we have a conversation, a very difficult argument, because there's a lot of things that just start piling up, and then there's that breaking point. We want to bring all those things up in that conversation.
Exactly.
But what is the most significant? So what really helps me is I write down what I've been upset about in my notes or somewhere.
Great.
And then I think about, okay, what is something that I really want to talk about now, and just focus on that. And then at the end of that conversation, I'll be like, hey, I still have a couple of things I want to talk about, but I think this was really nice. We talked about this and we resolved it, and I'm really happy about it. But I do want to let you know that I'm going to bring up a couple of other things just to give them
it's preparation, a heads up. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that's great.
It's helpful to do it that way. Just chunk it up.
Exactly. And another thing that I found very helpful when you chunk it up is also to say to people things like, I could be wrong, but did you mean this? So it just gives them a chance to, because so often we can misread. Some people are just not very good at expressing themselves, and they can say things in a way and it comes across in a terrible way. But they actually, and you say, this is how I perceived it, and they say, but that's not even remotely what I meant. So and that can lead to a lot of argument. So to say, this is how it came across. Is this what you meant? Am I understanding you correctly? And that can really diffuse the situation as well quite nicely.
Yeah, wow. That's very helpful, because I think that allows the other person to share their perspective, which is really, really important. Yeah.
Yeah. Then you bring authenticity on both sides of the conversation. You have it weighted equally, which is so important. I think any conversation, you don't want it to be weighted one way, because then it leads to the gaslighting type thing. And you want to have it nice and even keel. Otherwise it starts tipping, the seesaw, whatever analogy, the scales, whatever. Okay. So next thing, plays the victim. This is really a good one. So emotional dumping would be playing the victim, and healthy venting would be using I statements. I feel disrespected. So here it comes in with your eyes. I assume these are parallel. Do they kind of, okay.
I do think most of them are.
Kind of works that way. So plays the victim. So talk around that, the playing the victim, and how you can overcome that.
So again, going back to the you versus I statement, saying something like, you made me feel this way, really takes that accountability away from you. So you're playing the victim in this case, because yes, emotions come up, but the way we react is ultimately on us. We can process our emotions in very different ways. Feelings don't actually mean that we have to act on them. They come up, we can pause, we can self-reflect, and just allow ourselves to understand what's happening before reacting. So if the case was that we reacted in a way that was very disrespectful, or it was, it minimized that person's experience, whatever we did, instead of saying, you made me react this way, or you made me do this behavior that was very disrespectful towards you because of how you acted, it just turns into this blame game, and you're the victim in that situation, regardless of what you've done. It's not okay for us to not take accountability when we are in the wrong too, even if it was the aftermath of what had happened.
That's so good. So
it's better to use those I statements.
Very, very useful to say the I statements, because as soon as you start saying, you made me feel, or no, that's, you can't tell people how you feel. If you start saying, you made me do this, it's your fault that I'm reacting like this, because it never can be, because you can't be in that other person's head and react for them. So if a person does react, you're not responsible for their reaction. We're all responsible for our own reactions.
Exactly. Yeah, yes, that is absolutely true.
Yeah. So we've got to take response. And it doesn't mean that you're justifying that person could have really been mean, but you're still responsible for your reaction to that meanness.
Yeah. And I think if you show that vulnerability, if you show that accountability, like, hey, I also was in the wrong here, that person is going to take accountability too, because it opens that space for them, rather than them. They're like, okay, so she's owning up to her problem, or he's, really taking responsibility here for something that they did after the fact. But yeah, so I think it's really important to do that and allow that space for the other person to open up to, because that just creates that room, that friendly environment to
so good. Up. It's balance. It's all about coherence and balance. It's like in the brain naturally is designed for coherence and balance. So you want all the energy. You see that. So when someone is out of sync in their mind, you see that lack of coherence in the brain. So what you've described there is bringing balance. It's once again the seesaw, or the pendulum, or not the scales weighted evenly. As soon as they uneven, so these the emotional dumping kind of causes an unevenness in the scales, whereas the healthy venting does the opposite. I love this one. Not open to finding a solution is emotional dumping. So emotional dumping, just like you're just dumping, but not open to finding a solution. And then you say works on a solution together. I mean, it's obvious, but I think it's worth discussing.
So I think we've all been in these conversations where we're so on the defense, where we are just trying to prove the other person wrong and what they've done is just not okay, rather than really looking into, okay, why am I having this conversation? What do I really want out of it? And at the end, it's usually because we usually don't have uncomfortable conversations with people that we don't really care about. We sometimes just let things go and we just maybe cut them out of our lives, or, but if someone we genuinely care about, we value the relationship, and there's conflict, sitting in that conflict is so hard, and we just want it resolved.
Yes.
But when we bring up the conversation, sometimes we're just trying to prove the other person wrong, instead of really saying, okay, what do I really want from this conversation? And it boils down to, I want to get back to normal. I want to be able to talk to them properly. I want to be able to sit with them and, watch a show together again and just resolve this conversation that's important, but move past it. And the only way we can move past it is be like, okay, what is really happening here, and how can we make sure that this kind of behavior or this kind of thing does not happen again? That's the end solution. And maybe both of us have to work on it together to make sure that we are not repeating these patterns over and over.
Okay, this is so important what you just said. That's brilliant, because it's repeating those patterns over and over. And that can so often happen in a relationship where people, you find just, why are we here again? Why are we arguing about the same thing again? Why are we having this discussion again? That means that you haven't been solution focused. That means that every time it's come up, it's ended up being kind of sort of resolved, but not really resolved. The resolving was kind of brush it under the carpet, or ostrich in the sand mentality. So solution finding is hard work. It's kind of traumatic maybe. It means that you're going to have to face some things in yourself and the other person as well that's maybe not nice. It's uncomfortable. It's not comfortable, but it should produce a result, which means if it does happen again, you can catch it quickly and say, oh, this happened before, we now have a solution, and you can start practicing your solution. So it doesn't mean it'll go away from one discussion, because it does take practice to get a new pattern in place, especially if you've been married for years, or it's a sibling that you're living with, or some friend that you've been friends with for years or something. It is going to take time to change that. And I think that's what people need to realize is, don't brush it under the carpet. Find that solution. It's hard. And then practice the solution. And practice, don't just give up. Just keep practicing, and remind it, maybe even write it down or something. I don't know, write it down so you've actually can remember, hey, we had this argument. Let's go check in our book there. We had it like 6 times now. That was our solution. No more. Something like that, which is constructive, could also be helpful.
Yeah, I really find the writing down helpful. I actually do that. Yeah. And in my relationship, my partner was like, what are you doing? Why are you
recording these things?
Like, solutions for, okay, if this happens, what do we do here? But like, it's so important because it brings it into a conscious awareness for when the next time something is happening, because our emotions are so high during a conversation, which is an argument, that it just we forget about the solutions we came up with. We forget about just
so true.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to really repeat or bring that up every time that pattern is being repeated. So ultimately it gets minimized slowly. And with time, it might just go away completely.
Yeah, and you can. That's right. You can automatize. It takes 63 days to form a habit, not 21. So it's going to take, that amount of time. It's going to take about 9 weeks to change a bad habit in a relationship. And a lot of people aren't really committed to that, or they just don't get their head around the fact that it takes time, and it's easier just to blame someone else. And that's why I wanted to have this discussion, because people need to and you said something so important about how emotions can come up and how you can forget. So that's why it's so great to have it written down. And I always use this analogy of a tree for thoughts, because that's what they look like in the brain. And when you think of a thought, that thought could be, and that's a healthy thought. This is a toxic thought. I don't know if you've seen me use these before, but it's just so to sort of really undergird what you've just said, is like, if that's the toxic relationship issue and it keeps coming up, if you just keep stuffing it down, it's still there. You haven't dealt. It's real. It's in your brain. It's a structural change. And what's interesting about a thought is that, as you can see, there's all the branches. Each branch is representing a memory. So the thought is made up of memories. Like a tree is made up of branches. The thought is made up of memories. So memories are the branches, and the leaves are the emotions. So you've got information, emotions, which is the detail of the conflict, and then the emotions are the leaves that went along with that information. So emotional memories and informational memories. So like you said, when they come up, that both of those come back. And if it's toxic, this is healthy. So it's normally just, it's constructive. This is destructive. There's all the thoughts, there's all the emotions. And if they haven't been dealt with, as soon as they're in conscious awareness, they can be weakened and changed. But if they go back into the non-conscious, they get stronger. So when they come up, it's very important that we go back and find what was our solution, and remind us of eventually this gets weaker and weaker, and it literally melts in the brain. All the energy is transferred from there to there. And then you can remember how you were. But that takes time. And that's something that people need to really put in the effort. Because I think if they blame, we've done this, we talk, it's your fault. Meanwhile, don't blame. It means you haven't spent long enough working towards the solution. Okay, defensive to constructive feedback. Okay, emotional dumping. Defensive to constructive feedback and does not own up to mistakes. And then healthy venting, owns up to mistakes, open to constructive feedback. So do you want to talk about that? I love that.
Yeah, so this is something, again, similar to the taking accountability. So there's one thing where we ourselves decide, okay, this is something that I didn't do. I disrespected here. I wasn't okay in my behavior here. But then when the other person, how their experience was in that situation, and they say, hey, like, this happened and you did this in this situation that made me feel this way, we might not take that very well sometimes, because it can lead us to become defensive and just trying to justify our behavior rather than, opening up and saying, okay, I do understand that that was not okay. And, I'm going to work on it. That takes courage and it's hard to do. So a lot of times we just become defensive to constructive criticism, or we just tend to not own up to our mistakes, which is so important to allow that room for that healthy conversation and that solution to occur at the end.
That's so good. I think also the delivery of the constructive conversation is so important. Now, I always talk about delivery. Think of a gift. It should be, whatever you're saying should be like a gift that's all wrapped up beautifully. So if it comes across in an ugly way, like it's thrown at the person, it may be the most amazing words and the most amazing advice that will really help you, but it's delivered so badly that you don't get it. So I think it's so important that delivery, that you're giving constructive criticism, to make sure we check ourselves, that we're delivering it in a nice way. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. The delivery is where the magic is.
Yes.
It's really so important, because the way we might have a thought, we might think of something, and when we're trying to say it, it just turns into a very blame kind of situation where we're telling the person you, like using you statements.
That's right.
Really messes up the delivery. So
yeah, totally.
It's harder to talk about, I felt this way because of, it's harder to do this, but once we learn how valuable it is, it can really change the dynamic of the conversation and allow us to get to the resolution, rather than having this long conversation that just feels toxic at the end.
Yeah, and you just feel worse off for it. So it doesn't. So in other words, I love what you said there, that the delivery is the magic's in the delivery. And, so it's very much, I think this may be an option, so it's very much, and it's got to be gentle and watch the body. 50% of communication is body language. And sometimes people don't realize they're doing this, and it's people already responding negatively. And you're speaking from a toxic thought. Einstein spoke about this, the photons will be always generating energy. So if you are delivering something in an aggressive way, even if it's really good words, people feel that, like a little BB gun, the paintball guns. It feels that. You can kind of feel that. So it's so important that we are careful of our delivery. And I think if people were just like politicians and everything on every level, we need to be more aware of our delivery. Okay, next one, emotional dumping. Does not respect or listen to the other person's perspective, versus healthy venting, listens and acknowledges the other person's perspective.
So this is something that I think I even had a hard time understanding for a long time. This is where the understanding of our perspective might not be, or our understanding of the situation might not be the same as how the other person understood it. And a lot of arguments do happen because of misunderstandings of how, one person was behaving towards the other, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to provide that space and allow that person to, talk about how they thought of the situation. So kind of like what you mentioned initially, where it's like, so this is what happened. Tell me if that's what you meant, or, just give that room to explain themselves.
Yeah, I love that. And perspective is such a uniquely personal thing, and it's so important that we find that. So that's a really, really good one. And it's really it's empathy too, because you really have to shift your view and put on someone else's view, like take their sunglasses and look through their eyes kind of thing. And it's not that easy to do, especially if you work tough. So it's to get yourself calm too. Repeats this emotional dumping, repeats the same issue over and over. Says the same things over and over. Very, very tiring. Healthy venting does not go in circles. That's a really good one.
So this is where someone is explaining themselves, they blame the other person tries to explain themselves, and then it just goes in circles because no one is satisfied with what is going on. So they just keep bringing up the issue at hand over and over again, and it just turns into a very exhausting conversation rather than something that can be resolved. So I think there needs to be personal boundaries here, where if you bring up an issue and it is being repeated again, if you're doing it or the other person is doing it, just bring up like, hey, we already mentioned that. Let's focus on the resolution part of it now. We understand what's going on. We've talked about our experiences and how the misunderstanding was, or, how our feelings, how we felt. But now let's focus on the solution. And the important thing is that these conversations cannot happen when you are still emotionally worked up, when you are still angry or resentful. Well, you can be resentful, but not have those physical symptoms, not feeling like you are not able to think clearly.
Yeah.
So
very
that's
good.
important when you have these kind of conversations. Otherwise, you will go in circles.
That's so good. So you don't want to be so worked up that you can't think clearly, and you want to say, we've just gently delivery again. We've discussed that. Let's move towards the resolution. And if the person doesn't want to and they're getting hit up, it's best to remove yourself. And when everything's calmer, come back and readdress the issue. Then, inconsiderate of time is emotional dumping. Healthy venting does not take up unnecessary time.
So this is where, sometimes we have a conversation and people have things to do. We have work, we have other things in our day, and because we might value the relationship a lot and we're still upset about what's going on. Sometimes when we come up to talk about the situation, it just turns into hours of going back and forth, just a conversation that could have
exhausting.
Yeah, it can be exhausting, and it can lead to resentment after, because we could be like, because of this conversation, I wasn't able to do X, Y, and Z today. So it's really important to be considerate of the other person's time and really value, hey, I know you've got an exam tomorrow. Let's not talk about this today. Just be considerate of what the other person is doing that day. And when we have the conversation, if we're not repeating things over and over or bringing up the past, that can really reduce that time to what we need to focus on and move past it.
Love it. Fantastic. And then the last one here, feels toxic is the emotional dumping, feels beneficial, the healthy venting. Fairly obvious, but if you want to just say a quick word about that.
Yeah, I think ultimately, if we are emotionally dumping on someone and we're going into these long conversations without a resolution, it's going to feel toxic, because we still don't feel at peace at the end. We don't feel like, there's that feeling that, okay, this is probably going to happen again and we'll have to deal with it again. And usually when the pattern keeps happening, our response is just to shut down. We just like, okay, whatever, like no conversation. There's no room for conversation. We just withdraw, and that turns into that pattern that leads to so much resentment. So it is toxic if we are not able to engage in a conversation in a healthy way where we're both understanding each other's experience and not blaming each other, taking accountability, and just focusing on that one problem rather than multiple at the same time.
That's so good. That's so important that you don't just shut down and then it keeps happening and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. It's issues. If you're in a relationship with someone, you got to sort out your issues. Otherwise, it is just going to extend the time and make it worse. That's amazing. Okay, so the next one I want to discuss is cognitive distortions, another very important area. And when we talk about cognitive distortions like personalization or blame, should statements, emotional reasoning, magnification, or catastrophizing, and fortune telling. So let's talk about, first of all, if you can define cognitive distortions, and then we can talk about each of the different types.
So cognitive distortions are basically irrational or inflated thoughts that negatively distort our perception of reality. So these are maladaptive thoughts, and they can turn into patterns based on our own beliefs that we hold for ourselves. And they can be really difficult to identify if we're not aware of them. That's why it's important to teach about cognitive distortions and learn about them. So when they come up, we can call ourselves out. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the first one you have here, personalization or blame, and you define it. So if you want to just explain what that is. So personalization or blame.
Yeah, so personalization is something where we tend to really personalize things. Just it is how it says. So we, for example, something that happens, we internalize the experience and really take that into something that we identify ourselves with. So it's really important to not. So let's give an example of personalization. Okay, so we have expectations of ourselves, for example, and they're unrealistic. So when we tend to not meet those expectations, we personalize it into a way where we just start to believe that we are inadequate or just not good enough. And that's us personalizing that experience and really internalizing it based on that one experience.
So it's like almost related to shame.
Yeah. So we start to shame ourselves because of that. And it's really important for us to understand that that is not a way of thinking that is rational, because it's just one single experience. So really internalizing it does not make it into something that is beneficial for us in the long run.
So to keep the separation between I did that versus that's who I am. So that's the shame versus the guilt behavior kind of distinction. And that can happen when you're personalizing it. So you holding your, like you gave a great definition, holding yourself personally responsible or blame others for something that is not entirely under your or their control. So you can also do it to someone else. So it can be yourself, and it could be someone else, blaming someone else for something that they didn't do, or shaming someone else for something that they didn't actually do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I have an example in there for personalization. I think,
yes, if you assume you're a bad mother and your child gets into trouble at school. So your child gets into trouble, and then you personalize that, and you make out that you the guilty. It's your fault as a mother because that's your child, and you should have known that child's going to be perfect.
Yeah, again, that's an unrealistic expectation that mothers have, that they have to make sure that their child is this perfect human being who's taken care of, and they can't, we just want to protect them all the time. And when something that our child does, we might blame ourselves for it. And that's personalization, because that's a behavior of another person causing us to really put ourselves down.
And that could lead to a very negative kind of reaction as well, because because of that, you then get angry with the child and shame the child. So the child could end up feeling shame that they're a bad person when they're still trying to learn their way through it. So your distortion as a parent will then create a distorted response to the child, who then has a distorted response, and you could set up a very negative feedback cycle. So it's very important to recognize that, and as you say, call yourself out on it. Okay, should statements, the should have, could have, would have, all those things, focusing on how things should be based on expectation. That is, you beat yourself up because you should not have made so many mistakes during a presentation, for example. Okay, so let's talk about the should-haves.
Yeah, so should statements are basically, that's again based on the expectations we have for ourselves. So these are the unrealistic expectations, or the need to meet unreasonable expectations others have of us. So we tell ourselves, okay, I should be doing this, or I should be acting this way. Really, it comes down to testing or challenging what the expectation is, and understanding that, hey, I'm a human being, and I can't do everything all at once. I'm not a perfect person. So me making one mistake during a presentation, I should not be beating myself over it and saying, oh, I should have not made that mistake. My whole presentation was a disaster because of it. This is just coming from these expectations that we create of ourselves, or allow other people to have. Yeah. It can be both ways, but whenever we catch ourselves saying, oh man, I should have done this, or I should have been able to do that, really challenge that thought. Like, is this reasonable? Or is this just something where I'm a human being who made a small mistake or error? Does this really define who I am?
That's very, very good. And I think that's something that everyone does too often. It's too easy to do that. We need to be very careful of that. So it's a really good one to call ourselves out on. I like that. Emotional reasoning. And you define it here, assuming that your negative emotions reflect the truth, that you're feeling angry. So this proves that you've been treated unfairly. That's the example you gave. So emotional reasoning.
Yeah. So emotional reasoning is something that comes up a lot in arguments too, that we've talked about in the last few minutes here. So this is where, if we're feeling a certain emotion, we tend to really take that and think of it as a fact. So, we hear a lot about feelings are not facts. And this is exactly where it's important to understand that, because what we feel does not actually mean that feeling holds truth. So if we are feeling angry, saying I must have been treated unfairly, that's why I'm feeling angry, is an assumption. That person might not have done something to treat us unfairly. It might have been coming up from our own insecurities, our own triggers. So it's really important to understand why we're feeling angry. And the same thing is feeling anxious. When a big presentation is coming up, or something is happening, a big project is launching, and we start to feel anxious, thinking of it as I'm not meant to do this, or I'm not cut out for this, because of that anxiety, can really change that perspective of how we approach the situation. That confidence just depletes because we really identify with our feeling of anxiety. So it's really important to understand that emotional reasoning is a cognitive distortion, and our feelings are not always facts.
So as we're feeling that, like the anxiety before the presentation or the conversation with someone, and there's an emotion wells up, is not to just automatically assume that this is like a sign that I shouldn't be doing this or something, but rather to actually delve in and question, what is this? Is it valid in the situation? Is it appropriate? What am I actually thinking? Why do I feel this? And it's that process of questioning that's going to allow you to unpack that and find the truth in there before you just dive in and stop doing it. So it's once again to be very proactive and not reactive. And just that's such a good one, such an important one. We all do that. And this is another one that also does, it happens to everyone. Magnification or catastrophizing. And then you say imagining an unfavorable outcome to a situation and believing this outcome will most likely occur. Example, you get a we need to talk text message and right away you imagine the worst possible scenario or news.
So that's a common way to really understand what's happening. This can be even an email from HR saying, hey, can you come in? And you just start thinking about, oh my God, I've done something at work, or this is going to be, I'm going to get fired. Just coming up with the worst case scenario when it could have just been something completely the opposite, where they're just acknowledging, your efforts or whatever it is. If we don't know exactly what's going on, and we come up with the worst case scenario, we're basically self-sabotaging. We're putting all this stress and anxiety in us when we really don't know what is happening. Mm-hmm. And until we know that, there's no point for us to really sit in that feeling of worry or stress for that time, So mm-hmm. magnifying something or catastrophizing a situation can really lead us to be in this to have a stress response for a very long time mm-hmm. until the situation is resolved. So it's better to just really assess the pros and cons and challenge that thought. Like, I know the worst case scenario, but what is the alternative thought here? What is the best case scenario? Mm-hmm. And really ease that tension so we have that gray area rather than just leaning towards that worst case scenario.
Absolutely. That's so good. And also people can overgeneralize when they do something in their life and then they say, I'll always do this. There's that same sort of scenario as well. You make one mistake, or there's something happens, it always happens to me. So it makes it so much bigger, doesn't it? The overgeneralization, you're making it so much bigger than what it actually is. And you get this literal Broadway show going in your head from start to finish with all the acts. And 95% of the time, or 99% of the time, the research shows that those things are not going to come, that worry that you have is not going to actually play out anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's just how we are trained to think, but it's important to be consciously aware of it. And really
exactly. And then the next one you talk about is fortune telling. And that's I found fascinating, the way you explain that, jumping to conclusions by predicting that things will turn out badly. So predicting. So for example, you're going through depression and you tell yourself, I'll never get better.
Mm-hmm. So fortune telling is a magical power that we don't have. So really thinking about it in a way where just predicting the future, and it's usually if we're in a place of where we're feeling anxious or worried or just not thinking positively about a situation, the fortune telling is going to be negative. So it's again that assumption of what's going to happen in the future. It can be personal. So when we're dealing with depression, telling ourselves that we will never get through it, even when people tell us that, hey, they're supporting us and you will move on, this is temporary. If we are fortune telling and we're telling ourselves this, we will act the way we believe about.
Yeah, you do. You literally, you create your next reality. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's why it's so important to whatever we are putting out, even just the beliefs we are telling ourselves, the things we're telling ourselves, they need to be weighed out in a rational way rather than fortune telling the worst case scenario, like I'll never be able to do this or I'll never move past this obstacle. It's just a way for us to minimize who we are and what our abilities are. So not the greatest thing to do.
No, not at all. It's almost like, as you're saying it, I always use this analogy of you can look at life like this. There's the toxic fortune telling versus looking at life through this, which is your healthy, looking at it from a healthy perspective, which is very creative. This is very creative and this is very destructive. And it's also interesting because there's a lot of research showing, and I also found this in my research, that as soon as you have this perspective, immediately, not in a few minutes or a few hours or a few days, but immediately you change the activation of your gene code. So you right down to the the DNA level, you get an instant effect. So you'll increase the activation or decrease. So you switch on genes and switch off genes. So there's a shift in the activation. And sometimes you can shift the genes in such a way that they become vulnerable. And when they're vulnerable, that's when mutations happen. And then that throws your body into a state of inflammation and vulnerability and all kinds of things. So there's an immediate effect in the body for any of these, all these cognitive distortions. We feel that immediately. So that's why it's just so important to talk about them. Well, gosh, there's so much more that I want to talk to you about, but let's definitely have you back again for another conversation. Where can people find out more about you?
So the main page is the Instagram page, so the Brain Coach, as you mentioned. I am trying to expand. So I have a website now, nawalmustafa.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter there. And in 1 week's time, I'm going to be launching a journal. So it's just a free tool for people to be able to, really look at their life every day and organize it in a way that they're reacting to their environment the best way they can. So it's just something I create all these journal prompts, and people are like, can you just create
lovely. That's wonderful.
So I'm going to be doing that. So if you want that journal as well, it's just free. So you can just
that's wonderful. That's fantastic. That's wonderful. While we're on that note, I'm sure the journaling will help that a lot. You talk a little bit. I want to ask you one more question, if that's okay. You talk about mind reading and how can we avoid this. So let's just quickly talk about that as our final wrap up question.
So the mind reading, cognitive distortion, and how we can avoid it. So basically, mind reading is, let's give an example where, for example, we are walking on a sidewalk and we see a couple of people walking the other way and they're laughing. And they make eye contact, and you right away think they're making fun of me. There's something wrong with me. I might have, maybe there's something on my face, like whatever it is. We think of it in a way where it's about us, or they're thinking a certain way about us, which is usually not the case. But because of that spotlight effect that we have, where we think that a lot of people are focusing on us rather than,
they probably haven't even seen you. The chances are they haven't even seen you. Or if they did, you just
Exactly. Yes. Maybe sometimes they're not wearing their glasses and they just ignore you, and you just think, oh my God, like I know this person. Why did they say hi? They must have not liked me. So this is all mind reading, when we think someone is doing something or thinking a certain way about us because of these small nonverbal cues. And it can show up in relationships too, where someone just is having a bad day and you go to your partner and they're not talking a lot. They're just giving one-word answers, and you just think, oh my God, I did something to upset them. And
you say something, you text them and say, did I do something wrong? Meanwhile, they just want to they're just in their own space for that day. So
and I think it's really important to communicate here. If something is going on, if you think someone's thinking a certain way about you, just ask. Just say, hey, I'm noticing this. Is this, I think it might be just my perception of things, but I really want to just talk about it here, if that relationship is valuable. But there's also times where you can just challenge that thought. How likely is it that this thought is true, that they're actually thinking this way about me? And how likely is it that, they were just doing something else and they were just in their own little world?
It's once again that authenticity, just being real and vulnerable. You actually had these three more. I'm actually just going to quickly, we overgeneralization, we pretty much discussed that. Mental filtering, I think that's worth quickly talking about. Mental filtering and disqualifying the positive. Let's quickly talk about those two. So let's talk about mental filtering first. Okay, so the example, this is still in the cognitive distortions for those of you that are looking at the post. It's the second little page. I didn't ask, so I flipped over to the next page. Focusing on the negative aspects of a situation while disqualifying the positives. You dwell on a single negative comment from your boss and ignore all the other positive comments. So the focus on, like if you have 30 comments on your Instagram and 2 are bad, you focus on the 2 instead of focusing on the others.
Yeah. So this is mental filtering, where sometimes there's so many cognitive distortions. Sometimes it's just hard to.
I know there's so many. Yeah.
But I think one thing is, whoever's listening, I don't want you to feel overwhelmed because of all these cognitive distortions. There's usually a few that we tend to do a lot more.
Yeah.
So it's good to focus on that first and work through those.
Look at all of them. Listen to the descriptions. Look at all of them. Find out the ones that are most applicable to you. Write them down and then work on those.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's how we would be able to work through these things more consciously. But so mental filtering is where we take usually it's the most negative aspect of a situation and disqualify everything else that is positive. So again, the Instagram comment thing is very
relative
for me too. It's relevant here because sometimes I create a post and everyone is, this is so helpful. Thank you so much. It's impactful. But then there's that one person who's like, hey, I don't fully agree with this, and this is the reasons. And I have to really think about it and say, okay, you know what, this is an opinion of that person and it's coming from their own experiences and so on. So I have to just really take that in and not make that into my whole post is bad or my entire, work is not valid. Again, this can happen in so many situations, but really understand that focusing on that one negative thing is really creating this belief in you that you are not good enough or you are not worthy of, the good things that are happening to you. So it's just important to filter things in a way that is not biased towards that negative component of your life.
That's so good. It's so important to do that because we can get so stuck in that. Because I often talk about, people throw around the concept of negativity bias, that the brain has a negativity bias. The brain doesn't have a negativity bias. The brain is actually structurally, neuroscientifically, we see that it is actually wired for, it's literally the way the chemicals flow and the structures and stuff. It's for healthy emotions, healthy thoughts, healthy memories, etc. Or thoughts which contain emotions and memories. So I always explain it that we have a positivity bias. So when something is negative, it's so abnormal. That's why it grabs our attention. And when you shift your perspective like that, it helps with the mental filtering. That's what I've always found. Okay, so let's just quickly finish off with the last one, disqualifying the positive. And you talk about acknowledging the positive, but rejecting it instead of accepting it, like you land a competitive job, but you attribute it to a lack rather than your competence.
So this is something that can really show up when you have low self-worth. This is something that when even just the simplest thing where someone is giving you a compliment and you have a hard time taking that compliment because you think that you don't deserve it. It's you disqualifying all the positives about you because you're holding this certain belief about yourself that you might not be good enough or you're not competent enough, just something that is holding you back, and you are looking through that lens where you're disqualifying all these positive aspects about you and just taking that one negative comment again. It happens so often where we discredit ourselves for a lot of things and then end up doing this kind of thinking this way where we're disqualifying all the positives about us.
Meanwhile, if that person has said something positive, even if you don't agree with it, it's worth evaluating to see maybe you should agree with it because there's something you've done or said that's justified in their mind, the person giving you that compliment or whatever it may be, or the job promotion or whatever it may be. So it's kind of just stand back and observe that. So Nawal, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation and so helpful, and love to have you back again to discuss more of these really important things in this very practical way. So thank you so much for your input.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.